Carly adjusted her rear-view mirror, eyeing the dusty trail that wound back toward the main road. Her fingers trembled slightly as she made the adjustment, a subtle manifestation of the anxiety that had been building since they'd decided to make this trip. The remote lake cabin she and her husband Brian had rented was already receding into the distance, swallowed by dense evergreens that seemed almost predatory in their reach. They were miles away from the closest town, tucked deep within a forest that had stood sentinel for centuries. The isolation was absolute. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no lifeline to the outside world. Carly couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness as the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches casting shifting shadows across the windshield. Brian reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. His wedding ring caught the filtered sunlight, a brief glimmer that reminded her of happier times. "This is going to be good for us," he said, his voice filled with optimism she hadn't heard in months. That spark of hope in his tone made her heart ache. It had been so long since she'd heard him sound like the man she'd fallen in love with. Just the two of us, no distractions. She managed a smile, squeezing his hand back, noting how unfamiliar the gesture felt after months of careful distance. She hoped he was right. After years of small arguments growing into deep wounds, petty disagreements festering into silent resentment, they both knew they were on the edge. Every conversation had become a minefield, every silence heavy with unspoken accusations. This weekend was a last attempt to mend things, away from work, away from friends, away from the familiar routines that had numbed them both into a hollow existence of parallel lives. When they arrived, Carly was relieved to see that the cabin was as beautiful as the photos had promised, though something about its isolation made it seem both inviting and somehow threatening. It sat right at the edge of a clear, still lake, the water shimmering under the early autumn sun like polished glass. The trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves casting a vibrant mix of orange, yellow, and red reflections on the water's surface, nature's own kaleidoscope. The cabin itself was modest but cozy, with a wraparound porch that creaked softly under their feet, and large picture windows that offered an unobstructed view of the lake. It felt like a postcard, almost too perfect to be real. Brian grabbed their bags from the car, his smile widening as he looked around, his earlier enthusiasm seemingly vindicated by the cabin's charm. "This is exactly what we needed. Look at that view, Car." The old nickname slipped out naturally, and for a moment, it was like they'd stepped back in time, before the arguments, before the silence. She looked out at the lake, letting herself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. The water was so still it looked like a mirror, reflecting the sky above with perfect clarity. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could work. The thought carried both hope and fear. Hope that they could find their way back to each other. Fear that they might discover there was nothing left to save. Inside, they found the cabin clean and well-stocked, with an old-fashioned charm that Carly found endearing, though something about the aged wooden walls made her feel like they were being watched. It had vintage wooden furniture, each piece telling its own story through worn edges and subtle marks, soft rugs that muffled their footsteps, and a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The owners had left a note welcoming them and a logbook with the cabin's history. A charming touch, Carly thought, flipping through the yellowed pages as Brian unpacked. "It's all local families who stayed here," she said, running her finger down the faded entries. "Seems like a lot of people used to come up here to escape from the city." She noticed that some of the entries stopped abruptly, with no mention of departure dates, but she pushed the observation aside. "Can't blame them," Brian said, leaning over her shoulder to look at the logbook, his chest pressing against her back in a familiar way that made her heart skip. "Maybe we'll leave our own mark." There was something in his tone that made her shiver, though she couldn't say why. They spent the day exploring the woods, walking along the shore, and sharing easy conversations that felt both natural and forced, like actors who knew their lines but had forgotten the emotion behind them. Carly felt lighter than she had in months, laughing at Brian's bad jokes, feeling the tension between them ease, though something about the laughter seemed to echo strangely in the still air. They cooked dinner together in the small kitchen, the scent of pasta and fresh herbs filling the cabin, creating an illusion of domesticity that almost made her forget why they were here. That night, they settled in front of the large picture window, gazing out at the still lake as the sun set. The colors were breathtaking, a fiery blaze of reds and purples casting an otherworldly glow on the water. The lake seemed to absorb the light, transforming it into something deeper, more mysterious. Carly shifted, glancing at Brian's reflection in the glass. She was about to tell him how beautiful it all was when she noticed something strange. His reflection was smiling, a wide, genuine smile she hadn't seen in years. But when she turned to look at him directly, his face was calm, contemplative, almost blank. She felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine like ice water. "Hey, Brian, were you just smiling?" He turned to her, looking confused, his brow furrowing in that way she used to find endearing. "No, just watching the view." "Why?" "Oh, nothing," she said, trying to laugh it off, though the sound came out strained and hollow. "I thought I saw you smile in the reflection, that's all." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken uncertainty. Brian shrugged, but Carly noticed the way his eyes lingered on the window for a moment longer, as if searching for something in the darkening glass. She tried to brush off the feeling, telling herself she was just tired from the drive. But something about the way the reflection had looked, so real, so genuine, stayed with her. The next morning, she awoke to find Brian standing in front of the same window, staring intently at his own reflection. The early morning light cast strange shadows across his face, making him look older, somehow different. "Hey," she called, sleepily rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the unsettling dreams that had plagued her sleep. "You're up early." He turned, a strange look on his face that made her stomach clench. "Did you notice anything odd about the reflection last night?" A chill prickled up her spine, and she felt the hair on her arms stand on end. "You saw it too?" He nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "When you looked away, I swear I saw you in the reflection, looking different, like you were sad or something. But not just sad. It was like looking at you from years ago, when things first started going wrong." They exchanged a look, each sensing the other's unease, each recognizing the weight of what remained unsaid. Carly laughed nervously, the sound brittle in the morning quiet. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just our minds playing tricks on us. You know, being in a new place and all." Brian nodded, but Carly could see the tension hadn't left his face, and could read the doubt in his eyes. They both tried to shake it off, filling the day with more hikes, fishing by the lake, and exploring the woods around the cabin. But there was a new awareness between them, a heightened sensitivity to every reflection, every glimpse of themselves in windows and water. But that night, the reflections returned with a vengeance. As they sat by the fire, sharing a bottle of wine, Carly caught sight of the window again. In the reflection, Brian was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen in years, a soft, loving gaze that took her breath away, the same look he'd given her on their wedding day. She turned to him, ready to thank him for the look, but he was staring at the flames, his face lost in thought, showing none of the tenderness she'd seen in the reflection. She swallowed hard, a feeling of dread settling in her stomach like lead. "Brian, do you feel like the reflections are trying to show us something?" He nodded slowly, glancing over at the window, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. Maybe it's just the light, or the way the cabin is set up. Old glass can warp, you know. But his voice lacked conviction, and they both knew he was grasping at rational explanations for something that defied rationality. But they both knew it wasn't just the glass. As the days went on, the reflections grew more vivid, more disturbing, as if the cabin itself was trying to force them to confront something they'd been avoiding for years. One morning, Carly saw herself crying in the reflection, tears streaming down her face, even though she was smiling in reality. Another time, she saw Brian with an expression of pure, unfiltered rage, something he'd never shown in real life, but something she'd always feared lurked beneath his careful control. Each night, the reflections grew more intense, each one revealing darker and deeper emotions, like layers of an onion being peeled away to reveal the rot beneath. And then came the night when she saw it, the moment that would change everything. They were eating dinner, the cabin silent except for the soft clinking of forks and the crackling fire. The tension between them had grown thick enough to cut with a knife, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. Carly glanced up at the window, but the reflection was no longer showing them as they were now. Instead, she saw herself and Brian from years ago, sitting in their old apartment, both of them silent, the air thick with unspoken resentment. She saw the moment when things began to crack, when love started to curdle into something bitter and cold. She felt a wave of anger rise up, the memory of that argument as sharp as if it were happening again. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing to the reflection with a trembling finger. Brian looked up, his eyes widening as he saw it too. The image of their younger selves, caught in a moment of despair that had never truly ended. He stood abruptly, shoving his chair back with a screech that seemed to echo through the cabin. "This isn't right. It's like this place is trying to make us remember things we've buried, things we never wanted to face." They both backed away from the window, the eerie reflection flickering like a scene from a broken memory, showing them versions of themselves they'd tried to forget. That night, neither of them slept, lying awake in the darkness, listening to the sound of their own breathing and wondering what other truths the cabin would force them to confront. The final night, Carly's nerves were shot, her body tense and jittery with exhaustion and fear. She and Brian had barely spoken all day, the weight of the reflections hanging over them like a dark cloud. She could feel something building, something inevitable and dangerous, like a storm gathering strength before it breaks. That night, as they sat by the fire, Brian's reflection twisted into something she didn't recognize. His eyes were dark, his expression twisted with anger and accusation, showing her the face of a stranger wearing her husband's features. The reflection seemed to pulse with its own life, its own agenda. Carly's hands trembled as she looked back at him, her voice barely a whisper in the oppressive silence. "What's happening to us, Brian? Why is this place doing this?" He looked at her, his face weary and haunted, aged by the weight of everything they'd seen. "I don't know. Maybe it's showing us something we never wanted to face. All the things we've been hiding from each other, from ourselves." Their voices escalated, the tension and resentment they'd been carrying for years finally surfacing. But this time, it felt sharper, more real, as if the reflections were feeding on their anger, amplifying it, turning it into something monstrous and uncontrollable. Carly glanced at the window, feeling a surge of dread as she saw herself in the reflection, screaming, her face contorted in rage she couldn't control. Her reflection pounded on the glass, furious, as if it wanted to break through and take her place, as if it was trying to show her what she'd become, or what she might become if they stayed. She staggered back, grabbing Brian's arm with desperate strength. "We need to leave. Now." The words came out in a rush, driven by pure survival instinct. They packed in silence, their movements frantic and panicked. Carly felt the reflections watching them, waiting, as if they didn't want them to go, as if the cabin itself was trying to keep them trapped in this nightmare of confrontation and revelation. As they reached the door, she glanced back one last time and froze, her heart stopping in her chest. In the window, their reflections weren't leaving. They were standing still, faces twisted in expressions of rage, sadness, and betrayal that seemed to contain every negative emotion they'd ever felt toward each other. Her own reflection looked at her with a hollow, empty gaze, mouthing words she couldn't hear but understood in her soul. Warnings, perhaps, or prophecies of what was to come. Brian pulled her arm, his grip painful but grounding. "Don't look back." His voice was rough with fear and something else. Recognition, perhaps, of how close they'd come to losing themselves in those reflections. They fled into the night, the shadows of the forest pressing in around them as they stumbled down the path. Carly felt as if the reflections were reaching out, desperate to pull them back, to keep them trapped in that cabin forever, forced to confront every painful truth they'd ever hidden. When they finally reached the car, they didn't speak. They drove in silence, neither of them daring to look back at the cabin or the windows that had shown them too much truth. The darkness seemed to follow them, clinging to their car like a shroud. They never talked about what they saw that weekend, each trying to bury it, to forget. But every time Carly looked in a mirror, every time she caught her own reflection, she saw a hint of that hollow, haunted gaze, as if the cabin had left a part of itself inside her, a permanent reminder of the truths they'd tried to escape. And sometimes, when she looked closely, she swore she saw her reflection staring back at her with a knowing smile, a reminder of what she'd left behind in that cabin by the lake, and what might still be waiting for them there, in the depths of those perfect reflections, should they ever dare to return. In the years that followed, they worked to rebuild their marriage, but they never stayed anywhere with large windows, and they never, ever looked too long at their reflections, afraid of what truths might still be waiting to emerge from the other side of the glass. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through forested backroads that seemed to stretch on forever, each curve revealing another stretch of endless asphalt surrounded by towering pines. Max's hands were starting to cramp from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, though he couldn't explain why he felt so tense. He glanced over at his friends, each of them absorbed in their own worlds, blissfully unaware of his growing unease. Liam, ever the jokester, was grinning over his playlist choices, tapping out beats on the dashboard with fingers that never seemed to stay still. His energy had always been infectious, but today it felt somehow manic, desperate. Olivia sat quietly in the back, eyes glued to the scenery rushing past, her artistic mind probably cataloging every shadow and shade of green. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the city, but that wasn't unusual. She'd always been the observer of their group. Sarah was texting furiously beside her, trying to finish up a work message before they went completely off-grid, her fingers flying across the screen as if racing against time itself. The soft blue glow of her phone cast strange shadows across her face, making her look older, more haunted. They'd been talking about this trip for months, planning it like an escape route from their overly connected lives. A digital detox, a few days away from screens, work, and city noise. Just them, the woods, and the tranquility of a cabin miles from anywhere. Max was the one who'd suggested it, eager for a break from his own endless emails and notifications that seemed to chip away at his sanity piece by piece, and the others had jumped at the chance. They all needed this escape, though none of them had admitted just how desperately. But as they pulled up to the cabin, a strange feeling washed over him, a sense of unease he couldn't quite place, like a shadow passing over the sun. The trees seemed to lean in around them, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. He shook it off, forcing a smile as he put the car in park, trying to ignore the way the engine's dying rumble seemed to echo strangely in the still air. "All right, folks, home sweet home for the next 4 days," Max announced, putting on his best game show host voice, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. The others laughed, the sound slightly too loud and the forest quiet, eager to settle in, and they tumbled out of the car, lugging bags and supplies up the worn wooden steps that creaked beneath their feet. The cabin was just as cozy as they'd hoped, at least on the surface. Tucked into a grove of ancient trees, with a wraparound porch and a view of the lake that stretched like black glass into the distance, it felt secluded, safe. But something about the windows, their dark reflective surfaces watching them like eyes, made Max's skin crawl. They explored their surroundings, checking out the fire pit with its circle of stones that seemed oddly ritualistic, a small pier on the lake that extended into the darkness like a tongue, and trails that disappeared into the dense forest beyond, swallowed by shadows. But that first night, as they settled in, something felt off, like a note played slightly out of key in an otherwise perfect melody. Max was the first to hear it. They'd been chatting around the fire pit, flames casting dancing shadows on their faces as they laughed and reminisced, when he noticed a strange sound in the distance. It was a low, rhythmic hum, so deep he could almost feel it in his chest, vibrating through his bones like the purr of some massive hidden beast. He thought it was maybe just the wind through the trees, but as he listened, the hum became louder, more distinct, vibrating at the edge of hearing like a half-remembered nightmare. "Hey, do you guys hear that?" he asked, glancing at the others, trying to keep his voice casual despite the growing tension in his shoulders. Liam cocked his head, then shrugged, his usual smile slightly forced. "Nah, man, you're hearing things." But his fingers had stopped their constant movement, frozen mid-tap. Olivia frowned, tilting her head like a bird, listening for danger. "Actually, I think I do hear something. It's really faint, though." Her artist's sensitivity to detail made her words carry more weight, and Max saw Sarah shift uncomfortably. Sarah just laughed, but it was a brittle sound, dismissing it as forest noises even as her eyes darted nervously to the tree line. Max couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something ancient and aware. They brushed it off, joking about ghosts and creatures in the woods. But the sound lingered, an unsettling bass note that seemed to follow them wherever they went, like a predator stalking its prey. By the next day, the sound was more than just a faint hum. It seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, like the beating of an invisible heart, vibrating through the cabin walls with an intensity that made the windows rattle in their frames. Max woke up in the early hours, the sound reverberating in his ears, low and droning, as if something was surrounding them, closing in. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if it had substance. He nudged Liam, who was snoring on the bed across the room, though his sleep seemed troubled, his face twitching. "Hey man, wake up. That sound, it's back." His whisper seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. Liam groaned, rolling over, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Come on, Max. It's just forest noises. Go back to sleep." But there was fear in his voice now, a tremor that betrayed his casual words. But Max couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was growing louder, that it was coming from somewhere close, perhaps even inside the cabin itself. He got up and looked out the window, but all he could see was the dense darkness of the woods, shadows that seemed to move and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination working overtime in the unfamiliar setting, and crawled back into bed. But that night, his dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. an ominous hum threading through every scene like a dark melody. He dreamed of running through endless woods, the sound always behind him, always catching up, until it filled his head like smoke. The following morning, Olivia admitted that she too had heard the sound all night, a low, constant hum that had crept into her dreams, filling them with strange images she couldn't quite remember, but that left her feeling violated, exposed. Her usually steady hands shook as she clutched her coffee mug. "It's alive," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if she was afraid the sound might hear her. "Like something out there is watching us, learning about us." Her eyes were red-rimmed, haunted. Liam tried to laugh it off, calling them both paranoid, but his laugh was too loud, too forced, and Sarah looked unnerved, her usual calm replaced with a jittery unease that made her jump at every creaking floorboard. "I swear I heard it too," she muttered, picking at her breakfast without eating. "It sounded like it was coming from right outside my window, like it was trying to get in." Max decided it was time to investigate, though part of him screamed to just pack up and leave. They split up, each taking a different side of the cabin, hoping to trace the sound's source. But no matter where they went, whether on the porch that seemed to groan beneath their feet, by the lake that reflected nothing but darkness, or deep into the woods where the trees pressed in around them, the sound was there, an untraceable hum that seemed to follow them, always just out of reach, always watching. That night it became worse, as if their attempted investigation had angered whatever was creating the sound. The hum grew louder, more intense, vibrating through their bones like a bass note played through their very bodies. It was no longer just a background noise. It was invasive, crawling into their minds like a parasite. Max tried to focus on his friend's laughter, on the crackling of the fire, but the sound droned on, filling his head with dark, unsettling thoughts that felt both foreign and somehow familiar. As he lay in bed, he couldn't shake a sudden memory, a moment from years ago when he'd lost his temper and said something cruel to someone he'd loved. The memory came back in vivid detail, sharp and painful, the sound amplifying it, making it feel immediate, as if he were reliving it. He could see every detail of their face, hear the hurt in their voice, feel the shame burning in his chest. The sound seemed to pulse in time with his guilt. The next morning, he wasn't alone in his discomfort. They gathered in the kitchen, each of them looking like they'd aged years overnight. Sarah sat at the table staring blankly at her coffee, dark circles under her eyes like bruises. "I had these dreams," she murmured, her voice hoarse as if she'd been screaming. "Horrible dreams. Things I don't even think about anymore. It's like the sound was pulling them out of me, making me watch them over and over." Liam was unusually quiet, his usual humor replaced with a tense silence that felt wrong, like a fundamental law of nature had been broken. Olivia kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she could feel something lurking just behind her, waiting to pounce. The sound was no longer just a hum. It felt like it was digging into them, prying into their minds and pulling out things they didn't want to face. Regrets, mistakes, memories they'd long buried came bubbling to the surface like corpses rising from the depths. On the third night, Max woke to find the others already up, each of them sitting in silence, listening to the sound that now permeated the cabin like a physical presence. It was no longer faint. It was loud, pulsing, a relentless drone that echoed through the walls and seemed to vibrate in their teeth. "It's trying to get inside us," Olivia whispered, her face pale as milk, eyes wide and unfocused. "I can feel it, like it's searching for something, like it's trying to hollow us out and fill us with itself." Liam nodded, his face drawn, eyes hollow like empty windows. "It knows things I haven't thought about in years. It's like it's playing with us, messing with our heads, showing us all the worst parts of ourselves. They all felt it, a presence, an intelligence behind the sound, something that was deliberately, methodically unearthing their darkest fears and insecurities. The hum wasn't random, it was targeted, precise, as if it were alive, feeding off their memories and emotions like a parasite gorging itself on their pain. Max tried to convince them to leave, but when they packed up and headed toward the car, their movements frantic and desperate. They found the tires slashed, deep cuts that looked like claw marks, the gas tank empty as if something had drained it during the night. "We're stuck here," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking, tears streaming down her face. "It won't let us leave. It wants to keep us here until... As night fell, the sound became unbearable, a deafening hum that rattled their teeth, made their skin crawl as if trying to escape their bodies. Max felt it inside his head, twisting his thoughts, warping his memories until he couldn't tell what was real and what was a nightmare. He saw things, visions of people he'd wronged, moments he'd failed, his worst memories playing in a loop, each one more vivid, more painful than the last, until he wanted to claw his own eyes out just to make it stop. Olivia screamed, clutching her head, her nails leaving bloody crescents in her scalp. "It's inside me. I can't make it stop. It's replacing everything I am." Liam ran outside, stumbling into the darkness like a blind man, but the sound followed him, filling the forest, pressing in from all sides like a physical force. Max chased after him, desperate to escape the relentless hum, but there was nowhere to go. The sound was everywhere, vibrating through the trees, echoing off the lake that seemed to swallow their reflections. They regrouped, huddled together in the middle of the forest, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. The sound pulsed around them, a living force, pushing them to the edge of sanity. Their memories began to blur, merge, until Max couldn't tell which thoughts were his and which belonged to the others. In the dark, Max saw shadows moving, shapes that seemed to flicker and writhe, as if the sound itself was taking form, becoming something tangible, something hungry. The others saw it too, their faces frozen in horror as the darkness began to move with purpose. The sound grew louder, louder, until it was all they could hear, drowning out their thoughts, filling their minds with an endless, maddening hum. Max felt his grip on reality slipping, his memories merging with the hum, becoming part of it, like he was losing himself to the sound. He tried to hold on to who he was, but his identity began to fragment, dissolve. He couldn't think, couldn't remember who he was, only the sound, the endless droning sound that consumed everything, filling every corner of his mind until there was nothing left but the hum, the eternal vibration that had become his whole existence. Days later, a hiker found the cabin empty, the doors open, supplies left untouched as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-moment. There was no sign of the friends, no clues as to where they had gone, as if they had been absorbed into the very air itself. But every night the hiker swore he could hear a strange hum coming from the woods, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to follow him, echoing his steps with an almost hungry anticipation. And sometimes, if he listened closely, he thought he could hear voices in the hum, voices whispering names, calling for help, lost and trapped, forever part of the sound that would never let them go. Their consciousness dissolved into the eternal vibration, their memories and identities becoming part of something older, something patient, something that was always hunting for more minds to add to its endless song. The hiker never returned to those woods, but the sound followed him in his dreams, calling him back, promising to show him things about himself he never wanted to know. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, he would wake to find himself humming a strange, low tune, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere dark and hungry, waiting to welcome him home. When Lindsay received the letter, she almost threw it away. The cream-colored envelope felt heavy in her hands, its official letterhead bearing the name of a law firm she'd never heard of, Matthews, Stone and Associates. It was from a lawyer in some small town upstate, the kind of place that probably didn't even show up on most maps. The letter informed her, in cold, formal language, that her uncle, William Thorne, had passed away after a long illness, and surprisingly, had left her his cabin in a place called Darkwood Forest. Lindsay hadn't seen him since she was a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. She barely remembered him, just fragments that floated through her memory like autumn leaves. A tall, quiet man with deep-set eyes and weather-worn hands, always watchful, always alone. He'd worn the same brown jacket every time she saw him, smelling of pine needles and something else she couldn't quite place. Her family never talked about him much, and whenever they did, it was in hushed voices, as though his name were a stain they wanted to hide. Once, she'd overheard her mother telling her father that William had gone strange after moving to the woods, but when she asked what that meant, her mother had quickly changed the subject. But curiosity got the better of her, gnawing at the edges of her mind like a persistent itch. She didn't know why, but something in her wanted to go, to see what her uncle had left behind. Maybe it was an escape from her own life, which had become a suffocating routine of fluorescent-lit office cubicles, endless commutes on packed trains, and nights spent staring at her apartment ceiling, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Her job at the marketing firm had slowly drained the color from her world, leaving everything in shades of gray. The thought of the forest, with its promise of solitude and mystery, called to something deep within her that she'd almost forgotten existed. So she packed a bag, just enough clothes for a few days, her laptop, though the lawyer had warned her reception would be spotty, and a few essential supplies. She called in sick to work, something she never did, and drove upstate early one October morning, following the directions the lawyer had meticulously written out on firm letterhead. As she drove further north, the highways gave way to smaller roads, then to winding country lanes that seemed to grow narrower with each passing mile. The forest was deep and dense, the kind of place that felt like it had been forgotten by time. Ancient oaks and towering pines pressed in on either side of the road, their branches reaching across like gnarled fingers trying to touch. She could barely get a signal on her phone as she drove deeper, her tires crunching over a gravel path that wound between trees that seemed to close in tighter the further she went. The autumn sunlight filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, creating shadows that danced across her dashboard like living things. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving through the increasingly claustrophobic forest, she reached the cabin. It was small, weathered by countless years of rain and sun, with a faded green door that might once have been vibrant but had now dulled to the color of old moss. The windows were so dark she couldn't see inside, their glass reflecting the forest behind her like black mirrors. But something about it felt familiar, as though she'd seen it before in a dream, or an old memory that lurked just beyond her reach. The lawyer had told her she'd find everything she needed inside: keys under a fake rock by the steps, basic supplies in the kitchen, and all of William's belongings left exactly as they were. So she took a deep breath, trying to ignore the way the air seemed to thicken around her, and stepped onto the creaking porch. The fake rock was right where it should be, though it took her a moment to distinguish it from the real ones. The key was old and slightly rusted, but it turned smoothly in the lock. With another deep breath, she stepped inside. The cabin was dusty but surprisingly intact, as though her uncle had simply stepped out for a moment, rather than passed away months ago. Old furniture, crafted from dark wood that matched the forest outside, filled the rooms. Faded oriental rugs covered the wooden floors, their patterns still visible beneath years of dust. The walls were covered in photographs and paintings, landscapes mostly, but also strange, abstract pieces that seemed to shift and change if she looked at them too long. It smelled of damp wood and earth, with an underlying sweetness she couldn't identify. The scent brought back a vague memory of visiting once as a child. She remembered holding her mother's hand tightly as they walked up these same steps, and remembered the way her uncle had watched them from the window before opening the door. But she couldn't recall anything else about that visit, no matter how hard she tried. She spent the first day cleaning up, opening the windows to let in fresh air, though the breeze that entered carried that same sweet, strange scent. She explored the small rooms, each one revealing strange collections her uncle had amassed. Shelves of rocks with unusual patterns, jars filled with what looked like dried plants, and dozens of carved wooden figures that seemed to depict the same scene over and over. A person standing among trees, looking up at something just out of frame. In the corner of the main room, partially hidden behind an old armchair, she found a stack of notebooks. They were bound in leather, their pages yellow with age, each one filled with cramped handwriting that slanted sharply to the right, as though written in great haste. Some were journal entries, fragments of thoughts that often trailed off mid-sentence. Others contained sketches, intricate, detailed drawings of the surrounding woods, complete with notes and markings in a system she didn't understand. One page in particular caught her eye. A rough map of the forest, dotted with small symbols that looked like eyes or perhaps leaves. Red lines connected these symbols in patterns that made no logical sense, creating a web across the page. At the bottom, in her uncle's handwriting, were the words, "They watch me. They always watch." The words were underlined 3 times, the pen having torn through the paper in places. A chill ran down her spine, but she dismissed it as her mind playing tricks. The isolation, the silence. It all felt so strange after the constant noise of the city. She set the notebook aside, making a mental note to go through it more thoroughly later, and went to bed in the small room that must have been meant for guests. She couldn't bring herself to sleep in her uncle's room, which still contained his clothes and personal belongings, arranged as though waiting for his return. That night, she fell into a restless sleep, filled with dreams of trees that moved when she wasn't looking, and eyes that blinked open in the bark. She woke several times, each time convinced she'd heard footsteps on the porch or scratching at the windows, but when she looked, there was only darkness and the endless sea of trees. The next morning, determined to shake off the strange feelings that had plagued her dreams, Lindsay ventured outside to explore the area around the cabin. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine, though that sweet undertone remained, stronger now in the morning air. She walked down a narrow path that led deeper into the woods, hoping some exercise would clear her head and help her understand why her uncle had chosen such isolation. That's when she saw it, a carving in one of the trees along the path. At first, she thought it was just another piece of her uncle's strange artwork, but as she leaned in closer, brushing away moss and leaves with trembling fingers, she felt a chill run down her spine that seemed to freeze her very bones. It was her face, her own face, carved roughly into the bark with unsettling precision. The likeness was unmistakable, though the features were exaggerated, distorted in a way that made her stomach twist. The eyes were too large, too knowing, and the mouth was set in an expression she'd never seen on her own face, a mixture of fear and resignation that made her want to look away. She stumbled back, her heart racing so fast she could hear it drumming in her ears. She told herself it must be a coincidence, a trick of light and shadow, maybe just some random carving that happened to look like her. She hadn't even been here in years. How could it possibly be her face? But deep down, she knew. The carving was recent, the edges were still sharp, the exposed wood still lighter than the surrounding bark. But as she turned to walk back to the cabin, her steps quick and uneven on the leaf-strewn path, she noticed more carvings, each one closer to the cabin than the last. Some of the faces looked angry, their wooden features twisted in rage. Others looked sad, tears carved as deep grooves running down their cheeks. But all of them, every single one, bore an unsettling resemblance to her. It was like the forest itself was watching her, marking her presence, leaving her face on every tree like a signature she never agreed to make. That night, she tried to shake off the unease, telling herself it was just her imagination, fueled by years of ghost stories in the isolation of the woods. She made herself a cup of tea from her uncle's old supplies, though it tasted bitter and strange, and tried to focus on reading more of his journals. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows seemed to dance and shift, she heard a faint rustling outside, like leaves scraping against the windows. She forced herself to stay still, to calm her breathing, but the noise continued, soft at first, then louder, as though someone, or something, were walking around the cabin. The footsteps, if that's what they were, seemed to pause at each window, and she could have sworn she heard breathing, deep and ragged, just on the other side of the glass. She sat up, peering into the darkness, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She told herself it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon. But deep down, in that primal part of her brain that remembered when humans feared the dark, she knew it was something else. The next morning she found fresh carvings, closer to the cabin than ever before. The faces seemed angrier now, their wooden mouths open in silent screams, their eyes narrowed in fury. And there, on the front door itself, was a carving of herself, standing in the doorway, staring out at the trees. The detail was incredible. Every strand of her hair, every fold in her clothes, captured perfectly in the wood. But her eyes in the carving were different, filled with a knowledge or terror that she didn't yet understand. Lindsay stumbled back, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She tried to rationalize it, tried to convince herself it was just a prank, maybe some local kids who'd seen her arrive. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the woods was watching her, recording her every move, carving her presence into the very flesh of the forest. She spent the day searching the cabin for any clues her uncle might have left behind, anything to explain what was happening. She pored over the notebooks, reading his scribbled notes, his desperate ramblings about watchers and shadows and the ones who live in the spaces between trees. One entry stood out, written in a frantic, almost illegible scrawl that had torn through several pages. They know when you look away. Don't let them see fear. They feed on it, grow stronger from it. I've watched them watching me for years now. They're patient, so patient. They'll wait until you think you're safe, until you let your guard down. That's when they start carving. First far away, then closer, always closer. They're marking their territory, marking their prey. I should have left years ago, but now it's too late. They have my face. They have all our faces. She read it over and over, trying to understand. Had her uncle gone mad out here in the woods, driven to paranoia by the isolation? Or had he seen something out there, something he couldn't escape? She thought about the carving on the front door, how recent it looked, and wondered if perhaps he hadn't been as alone as everyone thought. That night, the sounds returned, louder than before, as if whatever was outside had grown bolder. Lindsay sat by the window, clutching a flashlight with white-knuckled fingers, every nerve in her body on edge. She wanted to leave, to run back to the car and drive away until the forest was just a dark memory. But something kept her rooted in place. It was more than curiosity now. It was a strange compulsion to stay, to face whatever was out there, to understand what had happened to her uncle. At midnight, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Not the random scampering of an animal, but deliberate steps, slow and measured, moving across the wooden boards with purpose. She held her breath, straining to listen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door, and then a knock. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there, echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. Lindsay felt a surge of terror, but she forced herself to stay calm, to breathe, remembering her uncle's words about fear. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see a face peering in, but there was nothing but darkness. Then she noticed the reflection. In the glass, just behind her, was a shadowed figure, standing in the corner of the room, watching her. It was tall, too tall to be human, its form seeming to shift and change like smoke. She spun around, shining the flashlight into the corner, but there was nothing there, just her uncle's old chair and more carved figures on the shelf. When she turned back, the reflection was gone, but something had changed. The glass itself seemed different, and as she leaned closer, her breath caught in her throat. There, etched into the window from the inside, was her face, caught in a moment of terror she was living right now. She backed away from the window, her mind racing, unable to process what she was seeing. She could feel them now, whatever they were, pressing in around the cabin, watching her every move through countless wooden eyes. She huddled in a corner, clutching the flashlight like a shield, waiting for dawn, knowing that something fundamental had changed, that she was now part of whatever strange story her uncle had been living. By morning she was exhausted, her nerves frayed to breaking point. She knew she couldn't stay another night. She packed her things quickly, throwing everything into her bag with shaking hands, leaving her uncle's notebooks and carvings behind. But as she opened the door to leave, she froze. There, on every tree along the path leading away from the cabin, was a new carving. They told a story in wood, her story, her arriving at the cabin, her reading the notebooks, and her sitting by the window last night. The final carving showed her now, standing in the doorway, her bag in her hand. She felt a wave of nausea, a deep, gut-wrenching terror that made her legs weak. She stumbled down the path, her footsteps loud in the unnatural silence of the forest, glancing back every few steps, half expecting to see someone, something, following her. The trees seemed to lean in closer as she passed, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. As she reached the edge of the forest, where the trees finally began to thin, she saw the last carving. It was on a massive oak by the road, a final image of herself. But this face was different. It wasn't frightened or angry. It was blank, empty, like a hollow shell of who she had been. Beneath it was a single word, carved deep into the bark. Welcome. Lindsay never returned to the cabin. She sold it through the lawyer, leaving the forest and its carvings behind. But the images haunted her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her home, that the watchers were still there, waiting just beyond her sight. Sometimes, in her apartment in the city, she would wake to the sound of scratching, like someone carving into wood. But there was never anything there. And sometimes, when she walked past trees in the park or glanced into mirrors, she thought she saw her own face looking back at her, twisted in a silent scream, a reminder that she'd left something behind in Darkwood, a piece of herself that the watchers would keep forever, carved into their endless gallery of faces in the woods. Now, years later, she still gets letters from that lawyer. They come every few months, always with the same message. Someone else has noticed the carvings. Someone else wants to sell the cabin. But she knows it's too late for them. Their faces are already there, waiting in the woods, watching through eyes that never close, in a forest that never forgets. Connor was practically vibrating with excitement, as they drove up the winding forest road, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm on his knee. The cabin was a few hours from home, tucked deep into the thick woods surrounding Black Hollow Lake, a name that felt more ominous with each passing mile. He and his dad hadn't gone on a real trip together in years, not since before Mom died, and this weekend was something they'd both been looking forward to for months. It was meant to be everything a father-son trip should be, a chance to reconnect, to spend time in nature, and maybe even bag a deer or two. The weather-beaten truck bounced along the unpaved road, each pothole sending reverberations through the aged suspension. Connor glanced over at his dad, Daniel, who gripped the steering wheel with his usual calm, focused expression, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Even at 16, Connor still saw his father as larger than life, the same way he had when he was a kid. Daniel had always been Connor's hero, the kind of man who seemed to have an answer for everything. Strong, steady, always knowing the right thing to say, the right way to handle any situation. But lately, things have been different. Ever since Sarah, Connor's mom, passed away 18 months ago, a distance had grown between them, subtle but undeniable. It was as if her absence had created a void that neither of them knew how to fill, a conversation they didn't know how to start. Connor hoped this trip would give them a chance to talk, to break through that silence that had settled over their home like dust. As they pulled up to the cabin, Connor felt a chill settle over him, despite the unseasonably warm October afternoon. The trees here seemed denser, darker than they had on the drive up, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The cabin itself was small and rustic, weathered gray wood that had seen better days, with only a thin gravel path leading up to the front door. The lake lay just beyond, its surface calm and still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. Something about that perfect stillness made Connor uneasy, though he couldn't say why. "Place hasn't changed much," Daniel muttered, more to himself than to Connor. There was something in his voice, hesitation maybe or concern, that Connor had never heard before. "You've been here before?" Connor asked, surprised. His father had never mentioned it. Daniel paused before answering, his eyes fixed on the cabin. "Once. Long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and Connor knew better than to push. Some questions were better left unasked, at least for now. They unpacked quickly, working with the efficient rhythm they'd developed over years of camping trips. Connor felt a flicker of unease as he glanced out the window, noticing how fast the sun was setting. It was only late afternoon, but already the forest was cloaked in shadow, the trees casting long, skeletal arms over the clearing. The shadows seemed to move differently here, stretching and contracting in ways that didn't quite match the shifting sunlight. "Let's get a fire going," Daniel said, his voice steady as ever, though Connor noticed how his eyes kept darting to the tree line. "It'll be a cold night." There was something about the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself as much as Connor. They spent the evening around the fire, talking in the easy, quiet way they always had. Daniel told stories about his own hunting trips as a kid, and for a while, it felt almost normal, almost like before. But as the night wore on, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It was more than just the usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of owls. There was something else, something watching from just beyond the firelight's reach. It was close to midnight when he heard it for the first time. A soft whisper, almost like a breeze, just outside his window. Connor froze in his narrow bed, listening intently. The whisper was faint, so low he could barely make out any words. But it was there, threading through the silence, weaving in and out of the darkness like smoke. It had a quality that made his skin crawl. Not quite human, but not quite natural either. "Dad, do you hear that?" he whispered, leaning toward Daniel's bed across the small room. His father listened, frowning, then shrugged, though Connor noticed how tense his shoulders were. "It's probably the wind, son. Nothing to worry about." But there was something in his voice, a careful neutrality that seemed forced. Connor nodded, trying to convince himself that was all it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the whisper had been more than just the wind. It had a cadence, a rhythm, like someone calling his name from far away, like someone he knew, someone he missed more than he could bear to admit. He lay awake long after his dad had fallen asleep, or at least pretended to sleep, straining to listen. The whisper came and went, rising and falling like a strange lullaby, filling the room with a quiet unease that seeped into his bones. Sometimes it seemed to form words, fragments of sentences that disappeared before he could grasp their meaning. Other times it was just a sound, a soft, continuous murmur that made him think of funeral homes and quiet goodbyes. The next day, they spent the morning exploring the woods, marking spots for their hunt. Connor felt more at ease in the daylight, the strangeness of the night fading in the face of bright sunshine and fresh air. They scouted for trails, laid out their supplies, and even stumbled upon an old deer stand that hadn't been used in years. The rusted metal creaked ominously in the light breeze, and Connor noticed his father giving it a wide berth. As they walked, Daniel's expression was uncharacteristically somber, his eyes flicking to the shadows between the trees. He kept one hand near the hunting knife on his belt, something Connor had never seen him do before. "This place feels different," he said, almost to himself, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Different how?" Connor asked, glancing up at his father, trying to read the expression on his weathered face. Daniel shook his head, a faint line of worry creasing his brow. "Just different, like something's watching, like something's waiting." He stopped, seeming to catch himself. "But it's probably nothing, just an old man's imagination running wild." Connor laughed, trying to brush it off as his dad was just being overly cautious. But that night, as they lay in the cabin, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. Connor lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the soft murmur drifting through the walls. The whisper had grown more distinct, like someone standing right outside the cabin, speaking in a low, hushed tone. It was almost soothing, almost inviting. There was something familiar about it, something that made his heart ache with recognition. Then he heard it, a familiar voice, a voice that made his heart stop and his blood run cold. "Connor, come outside. Please, baby. I miss you so much." It was his mother's voice, his late mother's voice, as clear as if she were standing just beyond the door, waiting for him. He bolted upright, his heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Every instinct screamed at him to throw open the door, to run to her, to fall into the arms that had always meant safety and love. But something held him back. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness of the night, or the way the whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Or maybe it was the memory of his mother's funeral, the absolute finality of that closed casket, the knowledge that some things can't be undone, no matter how much we wish they could. He looked over at his father, who was sitting up in bed, his face pale in the moonlight that filtered through the window. "Did you hear that?" Connor whispered, his voice trembling. Daniel nodded, his face set in a grim line. "I heard it." His voice was barely audible, as if he was afraid speaking too loudly would draw attention to them. They sat in silence, each of them too afraid to move. The whisper grew softer, fading back into the night, leaving only an oppressive stillness in its wake. Connor wanted to ask his dad what they'd just heard, but the words wouldn't come. How do you ask about something that shouldn't be possible? How do you face a miracle that feels more like a nightmare? He lay awake until dawn, haunted by the memory of his mother's voice, that familiar, loving tone that felt so real, so close. He wanted to believe it was a dream, that his grief had conjured the sound. But deep down, he knew it was something else. Something that had been waiting in these woods. Something that knew exactly what they needed to hear. The third night, the whispers came again. This time, they were louder, more insistent, like voices speaking over each other, threading through the walls, weaving into the darkness. Connor could make out phrases, familiar words, as though people he knew were standing right outside, just beyond reach. But underneath the familiar voices was something else, a deeper sound, like many voices speaking in unison, creating a harmony that made his teeth ache. Connor, please come out, a voice whispered. I miss you so much. We have so much to talk about. It was his mother again, her voice thick with emotion, filled with longing. But there was something wrong about it, a hollow quality that made him think of empty rooms and abandoned places. Connor felt tears prick at his eyes, an aching need to go to her, to feel her presence one last time. His hand moved toward the door handle almost of its own accord. But his father grabbed his arm, his grip firm enough to bruise. Don't listen, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's not her. Whatever's out there, it's not her. I've seen this before. These woods, they know things. They use them against you. Connor nodded, though he felt the pull of the whispers like a physical force, tugging at his heart, filling him with an almost unbearable sorrow. The voices grew louder, blending together into a strange, haunting melody, calling him outside, beckoning him into the forest. He could hear his mother's laugh now, the special one she saved just for him, and beneath it, other voices. His grandfather who'd passed away when he was 10, his childhood friend who'd died in a car accident, all of them calling, all of them wanting him to join them. At midnight, the whispers stopped, leaving a heavy silence that filled the cabin like a weight. The sudden absence of sound was almost worse than the whispers had been. The next day, Connor was jumpy, on edge, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. The forest felt darker, more oppressive, the trees looming over him like silent sentries. Even his father was quieter, his usual calm replaced with a wary tension. They barely spoke as they moved through their morning routine, both of them jumping at every sound, every shadow. As they walked back to the cabin that evening, they found something waiting on the porch. A small, weathered picture frame. Connor's breath caught as he picked it up, his hands trembling. It was a photo of him and his mother, taken years ago at the lake near their old house. He remembered that day with perfect clarity, her laughter as she taught him to skip stones, her warm embrace when he finally managed to make one bounce 3 times, the feeling of safety he'd always associated with her. The photo had sat on their mantel for years, until the day after the funeral when his father had quietly packed away all the pictures, unable to bear the sight of them. Connor looked up at his father, his voice shaking. How did this get here? Daniel shook his head, his expression dark. I don't know, but we're leaving first thing tomorrow. I should never have brought us here. I should have known better. There was something in his voice that Connor had never heard before. Real fear, raw and uncontrolled. They barricaded the cabin that night, every window, every door locked and bolted. Daniel pushed furniture against the entrances, working with a desperate energy that scared Connor more than the whispers had. But as the night wore on, the whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing through the cabin, filling every corner with a haunting, melodic call. The voices were no longer soft. They were pleading, begging, calling his name, urging him to come outside. Connor felt the pull again, a deep, aching need to answer, to step out into the darkness and follow the sound of his mother's voice. The photo sat on the table between their beds, and in the moonlight, he could have sworn his mother's smile changed, becoming wider, more inviting, her eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. But his father held him back, his grip strong, his face set in determination. "Whatever's out there, it's not her," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't listen, Connor. Don't let it get inside your head. Your mother, the real Sarah, she would never want you to follow voices in the dark. She would want you to live." But the voices wouldn't stop. They grew louder, more desperate, their tones shifting, changing, until they no longer sounded like his mother. They were darker now, deeper, filled with an almost menacing edge, like something was trying to break through, something waiting just outside. The whispers began to overlap, creating a cacophony of familiar voices, each one distorted, wrong, like beloved memories played backwards. Connor clutched his father's hand, his heart racing as the voices closed in around them, filling the room with a relentless, oppressive noise. It was like they were surrounded, the voices pressing in from every side, calling to them, beckoning them into the darkness. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move and shift of their own accord. They sat in silence, huddled together, waiting for dawn. The whispers faded just as the first light crept over the trees, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. The photo on the table was gone, as if it had never been there at all. They left that morning, not daring to look back, not daring to speak of what they'd heard. As they drove away, Connor glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing on the cabin porch, watching them leave. Perhaps his mother, or something wearing her face. But there was only the forest, dark and silent, hiding secrets he would never understand. The trees seemed to bend inward as they passed, as if bowing goodbye, or perhaps in disappointment. And sometimes, late at night, he could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, like echoes from a place he'd never returned to. A reminder of the voices that had almost pulled him into the dark, never to return. On those nights he would call his father, and they would talk about normal things. Work, school, sports. Both of them carefully avoiding any mention of the cabin or what they'd experienced there. But they both knew that something had changed in those woods. The distance between them had shifted, transformed by their shared experience with something they couldn't explain. They had faced the darkness together, resisted the sweet poison of impossible promises, and emerged stronger for it. Yet sometimes when Connor looks at old photos of his mother, he catches himself listening for whispers, for that familiar voice calling him home. And in those moments, he has to remind himself that love, real love, doesn't call you into darkness. It gives you the strength to walk toward the light, even when every step feels like goodbye. The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, nestled so deep in the woods that it was barely visible from the road, its weathered exterior blending seamlessly with the ancient trees surrounding it. The only sign of its presence was a narrow dirt path winding through the undergrowth, leading up to a place of silence and solitude that seemed to exist in a world of its own. It was exactly what Kara needed, though something about its isolation made her hands tremble slightly as she pulled her car to a stop. She had spent weeks searching for the perfect location to finish her book, a remote psychological thriller that had consumed her thoughts for over a year, seeping into her dreams and coloring her perception of reality. But with each chapter, she'd found herself more trapped in the narrative, her mind racing with plot twists, her heart heavy with an inexplicable dread, that seemed to grow stronger with each word she wrote. Her publisher's deadline loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon, and her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She hoped that the isolation would clear her head, help her focus, though a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that perhaps isolation was the last thing she needed. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, with an old stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and a single bedroom that felt more like a monk's cell than a place of rest. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the windows, giving the air a dreamy, ethereal quality. It had no internet, no television, just peace and quiet, exactly the setting she needed to channel her energy into writing. As she unpacked her laptop and notes, spreading them across the worn wooden table like pieces of a puzzle, she glanced around, feeling a sense of relief wash over her, though it was tinged with something else, something she couldn't quite name. Her novel had reached a critical point, a narrative crossroads that would determine everything that followed. In it, the protagonist, Anna, was being haunted by sounds in an abandoned house. Noises that began as faint whispers and escalated into violent knocks and crashes that threatened to tear apart both the house and her sanity. Kara had drawn on her own fears for inspiration, mining her deepest anxieties about isolation and madness, and the more she'd written, the more real it had felt, as if she were documenting something that was happening rather than creating fiction. But here, in the silence of the cabin, her story felt like fiction again, safely confined to the pages of her manuscript. The quiet was different from the city's artificial silence. It was deeper, more profound, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. It felt pure, untouched by human noise. The first night passed uneventfully, almost peacefully. She wrote late into the night, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she lost herself in her narrative. The only sounds were the crackling fire, which cast warm shadows across the walls, and the occasional owl hooting outside, its cry echoing through the darkness like a lonely sentinel. The silence was comforting, enveloping her in a cocoon of stillness that allowed her thoughts to flow freely, words pouring onto the page with an ease she hadn't felt in months. But on the second night, everything changed, and the line between fiction and reality began to blur in ways that would haunt her forever. Kara was sitting by the fireplace, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, lost in thought as she tried to capture the perfect words to describe Anna's growing terror. The scene was crucial, a turning point in the story where the supernatural elements could no longer be dismissed as imagination. She'd written a scene in which her protagonist was startled by a faint knock at the door of the abandoned house. In the story, it was a ghostly sound, barely there, almost like a figment of Anna's imagination, but carrying with it a weight of significance that changed everything that followed. As Kara typed the words, Anna heard a soft knock. She froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. A knock sounded at her door. It was so faint she almost didn't hear it, just a light tap, 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 like someone was gently testing the wood, seeking entrance. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the door, the sound hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. She shook her head, laughing nervously, the sound brittle in the silence. It had to be a branch or maybe an animal brushing up against the cabin. The woods were full of life, after all, even if she couldn't see it. But as she settled back down, trying to recapture her train of thought, the sound came again. 3 gentle knocks, perfectly timed, echoing through the silence with a deliberate precision that no natural occurrence could explain. Kara's skin prickled, goosebumps rising along her arms, but she forced herself to ignore it, to focus on her work. She told herself it was a coincidence, a strange trick of the mind, her writer's imagination working overtime in the isolation. But her thoughts felt scattered, her concentration broken. the words on her screen suddenly seeming to mock her with their prescience. The scene she'd been writing suddenly felt too real, too close, as if she were no longer creating the story, but transcribing something that was happening in real time. That night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that seemed to press in on her like a physical weight. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees, made her heart race. She told herself it was just the isolation getting to her, the natural response of a city dweller suddenly thrust into true solitude. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she had somehow crossed a line between observation and participation in her own horror story. The next day, she threw herself into her work with a desperate intensity, determined to finish the chapter and prove to herself that it was all in her head, just her creative mind playing tricks in the strange environment. She spent hours at the keyboard, her fingers flying over the keys, pulling herself deeper into her story, trying to lose herself in the fiction rather than face the growing unease that surrounded her. In the novel, Anna was growing more terrified as the knocks escalated, becoming louder and more insistent, taking on a personality of their own. They came in patterns, each series of knocks growing closer, more invasive, as if the house itself were trying to communicate with her, to tell her something she didn't want to hear. Kara found herself writing with a feverish intensity, the words pouring out as if they had a will of their own. As she typed the line, 3 loud knocks echoed through the silence. The sound came again, making her jump in her chair. 3 loud knocks, perfectly timed, just outside her door, each one seeming to reverberate through her bones. Kara's blood ran cold, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. She stared at the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't move, paralyzed by the sense that the line between her story and reality was beginning to blur, that she had somehow written something into existence that should have remained safely in the realm of fiction. Taking a shaky breath, she stood, her hands trembling uncontrollably, and walked slowly toward the door. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, each step seeming to echo in the stillness. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sound, any movement, any indication of what waited on the other side. But there was only silence, a silence so complete it seemed to mock her fears. She opened the door with trembling fingers, bracing herself for whatever might be waiting. But the porch was empty, the trees beyond swaying gently in a wind she couldn't feel. She looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to move and shift at the edges of her vision. But there was nothing tangible, nothing she could point to as the source of the knocks. Kara closed the door, locking it firmly, and returned to her laptop, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She couldn't let her mind play tricks on her. This was just a story, her imagination taking control, fueled by the eerie setting and her own anxieties about deadlines and isolation. But as she sat down, she noticed something strange that made her blood freeze in her veins. Her laptop screen flickered, the words seeming to dance and shift before her eyes, and the document she'd been working on had changed. The words she'd just typed were gone, erased as if they had never existed, replaced by a single line that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. "Stop writing." Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen, trying to process what she was seeing, telling herself it was impossible. She reached for the keyboard, her fingers trembling, and deleted the words, telling herself it was a glitch, just her tired mind playing tricks, the result of too many hours staring at the screen in the dim light. But that night, the knocks returned with a vengeance. They came at midnight, louder and more urgent, seeming to echo from every wall of the cabin. 3 knocks, followed by a silence that seemed to listen, then 3 more, each series more demanding than the last. Each knock seemed to reverberate through the cabin, rattling the windows in their frames, filling her with a sense of dread that went beyond mere fear into something primal and overwhelming. She sat on the edge of her bed, her body tense, listening as the knocks grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was causing them was growing impatient. It was as if the cabin itself were coming alive, echoing the scenes from her story, each knock pulling her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape, a horror story that had somehow broken free from the confines of her imagination. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her, waiting for her to make a move, to continue the story that had taken on a life of its own. She glanced at her laptop, still open on the desk, the cursor blinking on an empty page like a heartbeat, her story hanging in the balance. She wanted to stop, to pack her things and leave the cabin and never look back, but something held her in place, a dark curiosity that compelled her to keep going, to see how the story would end. With a surge of determination that felt more like resignation, she returned to her laptop, typing furiously, her fingers racing over the keys as she poured her fear into the story, using her terror as fuel for the narrative. In the novel, Anna was finally confronting the source of the knocks, demanding to know who was haunting her, trying to push back against the presence that had invaded her life and threatened to destroy everything she held dear. As Kara typed, the knocks grew louder, more aggressive, the impacts shaking dust from the ceiling, as if something were trying to break through the very walls of the cabin, to get inside and claim what it had come for. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her in a cacophony of impacts that threatened to drive her mad. In the story, Anna reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling, her heart pounding as she prepared to confront whatever was waiting on the other side. Kara could feel her own heart racing in perfect synchronization with her characters, each word pulling her deeper into the story, blurring the line between fiction and reality until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. She finished the sentence, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hit the keys, and just as she typed the words, Anna opened the door. A deafening crash echoed through the cabin, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass filling the air with a violence that seemed to tear reality apart. Kara screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as she looked around wildly, her mind unable to process what was happening. The front door hung open, the wood splintered around the lock as if it had been struck by an immense force. She backed away, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stared at the empty doorway that seemed to lead into absolute darkness. She could feel something there, a presence, a cold, dark force that seemed to seep into the room like smoke, filling the air with a suffocating dread that made it hard to breathe. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by her own ragged breaths and the pounding of her heart, her body frozen in terror as she waited, knowing that whatever she had summoned through her writing was here, inside the cabin with her. The next morning, Kara's publisher received a frantic call from a ranger in the area, his voice shaking as he described what they'd found. The cabin door was broken, hanging from its hinges as if it had been hit by a tremendous force. The furniture was overturned, the windows shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor like fallen stars. The walls were marked with strange patterns, as if something had been trying to write its own story in the wood. But Kara was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Her laptop was open on the desk, somehow untouched amid the chaos, the screen still glowing with an unnatural light. The document showed the last words she'd typed, a final testament to whatever had happened in that isolated cabin. Anna opened the door, and the silence was broken. The authorities searched the area for days, combing through the woods, following every possible lead. But there was no sign of Kara, no trace of what had happened to her in those final moments. Her story remained unfinished, her fate hanging in the balance, a mystery as haunting as the words she'd left behind. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the wind whispers through the trees, other writers who visited the cabin swore they could hear faint knocks on the door, each one echoing through the silence, as though someone, or something, were waiting to finish the story that Kara had started. They say that if you listen carefully, you can hear typing in the dead of night, the soft click of keys forming words that tell of horrors beyond imagination, as if Kara were still there, still writing, trapped forever in the story she had brought to life. But no one stays long enough to read what's being written. They say the knocks have gotten louder lately, more insistent, as if whatever haunts the cabin is growing impatient, waiting for someone else to open the door and join Kara in the eternal silence that lies beyond the world of words. The cabin was quaint, nestled deep in the mountains like a secret waiting to be discovered, miles from the nearest town or sign of civilization. Julie had found it online after weeks of searching, a charming place to celebrate her and Tom's 5th anniversary, away from the endless cacophony of city noise and the crushing weight of work deadlines. The listing had promised solitude and serenity, and as their car wound up the narrow mountain road, each turn taking them further from the world they knew, Julie felt a growing sense that this was exactly what they needed. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of pine trees, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across their path. As they pulled up to the cabin, Julie took in the quiet surroundings, the air fresh with the heady scent of pine and damp earth that seemed to cleanse her lungs of city smog. The cabin was older than she'd expected, with weathered wood that spoke of decades of mountain winters, and a slightly tilted roof that gave it a whimsical, almost fairy tale appearance. Despite its age, or perhaps because of it, there was a certain charm to the place, something warm and inviting that seemed to welcome them home. She squeezed Tom's hand, feeling the familiar calluses on his palm, smiling as she watched his face take in their surroundings. "It's perfect, don't you think?" Her voice sounded small in the vast silence of the mountains, almost as if the forest were swallowing her words. Tom chuckled, nodding as he pulled their bags from the trunk. The sound seemed to echo strangely in the still air. "It's definitely secluded. No cell service, no distractions. Just us and the mountains." He paused, looking up at the looming peaks that seemed to watch over the cabin like ancient guardians. "Though I have to admit, it's a bit more remote than I expected." They spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking their clothes into the old pine dresser that smelled faintly of mothballs, and exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small fire pit in the back, its stones arranged in a perfect circle that seemed almost too precise to be natural. A narrow trail led into the forest, disappearing around a bend that promised adventure, and a quiet stream gurgled a few yards from the cabin, its gentle sound a constant whisper in the background. Everything about the place felt untouched, preserved in a strange kind of stillness that Julie found both comforting and slightly unsettling, as if they had stepped into a place where time moves differently. The interior of the cabin was a testament to simple living. A small kitchen with worn but clean countertops, a living area with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and a bedroom just large enough for a queen-sized bed and the ancient dresser. The walls were lined with knotty pine that seemed to absorb the light, creating deep shadows in the corners that shifted as the sun moved across the sky. It wasn't until the evening, as they were setting up for their anniversary dinner, that Julie found it. The object that would change everything about their peaceful retreat. She'd been looking for a lighter in one of the kitchen drawers, her hand rummaging through the usual cabin detritus, old matches, forgotten utensils, bits of string, when her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Pulling it out, she discovered an old, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn with age, with the words, "Visitor's Log," stamped on the front in faded gold lettering that caught the dying sunlight. Curious, she flipped it open, the spine crackling in protest, and saw that it was filled with entries dating back decades. The pages were yellowed and dog-eared, some spotted with water stains or what looked like coffee rings, each one covered in different handwriting styles that told their own stories. Most of them were simple, everyday comments, notes about the weather, memories of campfires under starlit skies, small anecdotes from visitors who had come to the cabin before them, seeking their own escape from the world. "Hey, Tom, check this out," she called, bringing the book over to the table where he was opening a bottle of wine. "It's a logbook. Looks like people have been leaving entries here for years." She ran her finger down one of the pages, feeling the indentations where pens had pressed stories into paper. Tom leaned over, flipping through the pages with interest, a smile spreading across his face as he read random entries. "That's pretty cool. Some of these entries are from the 70s. This place must be older than I thought." He paused on one entry, chuckling. "Listen to this one. July 1976. Saw a bear trying to steal our cooler. Had to watch our picnic basket disappear into the woods. Yogi was real after all." They read through a few more of the entries, laughing at the little stories and jokes left by previous visitors, each one a snapshot of someone else's adventure in these mountains. But as they reached the middle of the book, Julie noticed something change. The tone of the entries began to shift, subtle at first, then more dramatically, like sunshine giving way to storm clouds. One entry, dated October 13th, 1984, caught her eye. The handwriting more hurried, less controlled than the others. "Strange sounds in the night. We thought it was just the wind, but it felt different. Something about it made our skin crawl. We're leaving early tomorrow. Can't shake the feeling we're not wanted here." Julie and Tom exchanged a glance, a shiver running down Julie's spine despite the warmth of the cabin. She flipped to the next entry, which was from the following year, on the exact same date. "We heard footsteps around the cabin last night. Slow, deliberate, like someone was making circuits around the building. No sign of anyone this morning, no tracks in the dirt. Oddly enough, the date matches last year's entry. Just a coincidence, I'm sure, but it makes you wonder." Tom's smile faded, replaced by a slight furrow between his brows. "That's weird. What are the odds they'd both mention something strange happening on the same date?" His voice had lost its earlier lightness, taking on an edge of concern. Julie shrugged, trying to laugh it off, but she felt a flicker of unease in her stomach, like a cold hand brushing against her insides. They continued reading, skimming through the entries, each one growing darker, more unsettling. Each year, someone seemed to mention strange occurrences around the same date, October 13th. The consistency was unnerving, like a pattern emerging from chaos. One entry from the early 90s made Julie's breath catch. "Woke up to find muddy footprints on the porch. They led to the door but didn't go back. We left the cabin unlocked. Are they just playing with us? The prints looked fresh, but there was no mud anywhere else, not even on the path. It's like they appeared from nowhere." Another, dated October 13th, 1998, was written in a shaky hand that barely seemed able to form the letters. "If you're reading this, get out before nightfall. They come when the sun sets. They knock. They wait. Don't answer. Don't let them in. For God's sake, don't let them in." Julie shut the book with a snap that echoed through the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears, shaking her head. Okay, someone definitely had a twisted sense of humor. People probably write these things just to mess with future guests. "Yeah, probably just people trying to scare the next visitors," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Julie noticed he was glancing at the windows more frequently, as if checking to make sure nothing was looking in. He took the book from her hands, setting it back in the drawer with perhaps more force than necessary. "We didn't come all the way up here to get freaked out over some old logbook. Let's just enjoy our anniversary weekend." Julie agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had crept over her like a shadow. As they finished dinner, the wind picked up outside, rustling through the trees with a sound like whispered conversations. The branches cast strange, moving shadows across the windows, and Julie found herself avoiding looking directly at them, afraid of what she might see. That night, as they lay in bed, Julie thought she heard something that made her blood run cold. A faint, shuffling sound, like footsteps in dead leaves, moving around the cabin. She lay perfectly still, holding her breath, listening as the sound grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Each step seemed carefully placed, as if whatever was out there was taking its time, savoring their growing fear. She nudged Tom, her voice barely a whisper in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" He sat up, his body tense beside her, straining to listen. The sound had stopped, leaving only the wind whistling through the trees, but Julie could tell from his rigid posture that he'd heard it too. "Probably an animal," he murmured, though he didn't sound convinced. "Bears are common up here." They lay in silence, both of them tense, listening to the night sounds that suddenly seemed full of hidden meaning. But the footsteps didn't return, and eventually, exhaustion overcame their fear, and they drifted off into uneasy sleep filled with dreams of dark figures watching from the trees. The next morning, as Julie stepped onto the porch with her coffee, she froze, the mug slipping from her nerveless fingers and shattering on the wooden boards. There, on the steps, were muddy footprints leading to the door. They were deeply pressed into the wood, each one perfect and distinct, despite there being no mud anywhere else on the property. She felt her heart skip a beat, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Tom, come look at this." Her voice shook despite her effort to keep it steady. He joined her, his face going pale as he took in the footprints. They were large, deeper than they should be, as though someone, or something, had been standing there for a long time, waiting. But what was most unsettling was that there were no footprints leading away. Whoever had made them had simply vanished. Maybe it was an animal, she suggested, though they both knew it was a weak excuse. The prints were clearly human, each toe distinct, the arch and heel perfectly formed. Tom shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "No animal makes footprints like that. And they lead straight to the door, just like the logbook said." He paused, swallowing hard. "Just like the entry from the 90s. They went inside, closing the door firmly behind them and turning the lock with trembling hands. The cabin felt different now, colder somehow, the walls pressing in around them, the stillness that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now feeling oppressive, watchful. They spent the day trying to ignore the unease that had settled over them, taking long walks on the trail, making forced small talk, anything to keep their minds off the logbook and its warnings. But as dusk fell, Julie felt the tension creep back like a living thing. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just a story, just people trying to scare each other, a decades-long practical joke. But as the sun disappeared behind the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for darkness to fall. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, they heard it again. A soft, deliberate knock at the door, so gentle it could have been mistaken for a branch tapping against the wood. But they both knew it wasn't. They froze, their eyes meeting in the dim light, seeing their own terror reflected back at them. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent, echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. Julie's heart raced. her breath coming in shallow gasps that seemed too loud in the silence. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her pounding heart. "Whatever happens, don't open it." Tom nodded, his face pale in the darkness, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. They sat in silence, waiting, the knock coming again and again, each one more insistent, more demanding than the last. It sounded like someone, something, trying to get in, trying to break through the silence and darkness that protected them. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the knocking stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake that felt even more threatening than the noise had been. They sat in silence for what felt like hours, neither of them daring to move, barely daring to breathe. But eventually, exhaustion overcame terror, and they drifted into a fitful sleep, filled with dreams of knocking doors and muddy footprints that led nowhere. In the morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows making everything seem normal again, they found another entry in the logbook. Julie's hands shook as she opened it, knowing what they would find but needing to see it anyway. The ink was fresh, still slightly wet to the touch, the handwriting shaky as though written in a hurry or with trembling hands. It read, "The same thing every year. They knock, they wait. Don't answer. Don't let them in. They're patient. They'll wait forever if they have to. But whatever you do, don't open the door. What's outside isn't meant to come in." Julie felt a wave of nausea, her mind reeling as she stared at the fresh ink. She looked at Tom, her voice trembling. Who could have written this? We were awake all night. No one came in." He shook his head, his face ashen, aged somehow in the pale morning light. "No one's been here but us. But someone, something, wrote in that book last night." They packed their bags in silence, neither of them wanting to stay another moment in the cabin that no longer felt welcoming but threatening. They left without looking back, their footsteps echoing through the empty forest as they hurried down the trail to their car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet seeming unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. As they reached the car, Julie felt compelled to take one last look, her heart pounding against her ribs. There, on the porch, was a figure, shadowed, barely visible in the morning light, its edges seeming to blur into the darkness of the doorway. It stood perfectly still, watching them, waiting. As she stared, unable to look away, she could have sworn it raised a hand in farewell. They drove away, the cabin disappearing into the trees behind them, but the memory lingered, a haunting reminder of the visitor's log and the warnings they hadn't heeded. The mountain road seemed to stretch forever, each turn revealing more forest, more shadows, until Julie wasn't sure they would ever find their way back to the world they knew. And every year, on October 13th, Julie thought about the cabin, about the logbook, and the fresh entry that had appeared while they slept. She wondered about other visitors, other entries, other nights of knocking that echoed through the mountain silence. A part of her knew that somewhere, deep in those woods, the knocking continued, echoing through the silence, waiting for someone else to answer. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispered through the trees, she thought she could hear it, a soft, patient tapping, like someone gently testing the strength of her door, waiting to be invited in.